Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our July 7th webinar. My name is Elena Gilbert, and I will be your host for this wonderful journey where we talk about membership meetings, elections, and actions outside of a meeting, dotting your I's and crossing your T's. So welcome. Hopefully most of this is going to be a review for all of you. But I think it's a good review to have as we're getting somewhat close to annual meeting election season. And so it's always good to make sure we've got all our ducks in a row when it comes to holding these meetings. So before I go on with all the information, allow me to do some webinar housekeeping, as we like to call it. So for those of you who have not been on one of our webinars before, what you should see in front of you, the majority of your screen should be the PowerPoint where it says, "Are you lonely?" Okay, so look at "Are you lonely?" I am at the bottom right-hand corner. Hello, this is me. And on the left side, you will see some icons, and one of those is a little talking bubble icon. And so that is, click on that if you have questions during the presentation, and you can type them in there and I will get them. I'll answer them all at the end. I just want to make sure we get through all the materials first, and then we'll go through questions and hopefully have enough time left over to get through all of them. And otherwise, you are eligible to get 1 CMCA credit for attending this webinar. They are automatically generated based on your attendance, and they will be emailed to you within the next 1 to 2 days. If it's been a couple days and you haven't received an email from us with it, check your spam first. And if you still haven't received it, please feel free to email education@altitude.law. If while we are holding this webinar, you have any technical difficulties, please also shoot an email to the same address, education@altitude.law, or call our direct line at 303-432-9999. Again, I personally can't do anything to help you with any technical problems you may have, but if you either email or call the number, someone on that end should be able to assist you. All right, so without further ado, are you guys ready for this? And this is, in a live class, everybody would yell, yes, yes, we're ready. So I'm just going to assume you're all yelling with excitement that you are ready. One thing I want to point out is that this webinar, we're only talking about membership meetings. We are not talking about board meetings. So please keep that in mind as we talk about, the various requirements. Board meetings are different and have completely different requirements. So this is all for membership meetings. So really annual meetings are kind of the big one, right? That's the big one that associations have to have every year. Typically, we have our elections during the annual meeting. We do an update to all our homeowners as far as what's transpired in the community, over the last year, go over financials. I mean, whatever it is, that's kind of our big meeting. That's the one that homeowners look forward to. Boards may not look forward to them, the homeowners, I think, do. So again, to dot our I's and cross our T's, hopefully this is all review. Meeting notice, annual meeting notice, you're sending them out 10 to 50 days in advance of the meeting. This is a requirement under Kiowa. Now, if you have documents that have a different requirement, this Kiowa requirement overrides it. Ideally, if you could comply with both sets of requirements, that gives your homeowners less to complain about. So if, let's say, you have a 30 to 60 day notice requirement in your bylaws, but Kiowa says it's 10 to 50, if you send it 30 days out, you'd be complying with both sets of requirements. And then you don't have to listen to homeowners say, hey, the bylaws say 30 to 60, and you don't have to explain to them that legally it's Kiowa that is going to set that time frame. But 10 to 50 days is what Kiowa has. Snail mail, hand delivery. So your annual meeting notices must be delivered by one of these two methods, either snail mail or hand delivered. Most associations, most boards, most community managers do not desire to go door to door and hand deliver meeting notices. So most of the time we are looking at snail mail. However, you know, maybe in a smaller community where everyone knows everyone else, maybe that way it's easier to just hand deliver them. Just a rule of thumb for hand delivery, if you are doing hand delivery and you want to live on the edge like that, that's fine, but make sure you get some sort of a signed acknowledgement of receipt from the homeowner, because otherwise it's a he said, she said. So even though you may hand deliver something to someone, they can later claim that you never delivered it to them, and it's your word against theirs. So get something signed in writing to avoid any kind of confusion in the future. Also, you don't want to leave them on someone's, taped to their door or on their porch. Hand delivery means you put it in their hand and you give it to them. The good thing about using snail mail is in Colorado, at least, we have a legal presumption of receipt, which means if you testify that you put everything in the mailbox and you give me a mailing list, the courts will presume that the addressee has received the notice. So it's actually kind of a very cool thing, and we like using that. So I always prefer snail mail. So in addition to that, there's also a requirement that notice of homeowner meetings be physically posted in a conspicuous location in the community. What is that? It could be anything. It could be, if you have a clubhouse, it could be at the clubhouse. It could be a sandwich board in front of the entry monument. It could be something by the mailboxes. Almost every community has some sort of area that is pretty conspicuous. And so most of the time, it's very difficult to say we don't have a conspicuous location. You usually do. So physically post. Kiowa doesn't tell you how far in advance you have to post it or what kind of physical posting is required. So, a sandwich board is fine. A flyer in your little bulletin board is fine. It just has to be physical. An email is not physical posting unless you're printing it out and posting it somewhere. Okay. Email notice. If your homeowners request notice via email, you should send it to them via email. But that is in addition to snail mail and physical posting. That is not a replacement of any of these other methods of providing notice. All right. Again, there is no rule in Kiowa as to when it gets emailed or when physically things get posted. It's totally up to the board. What I typically see is about, anywhere from 2 to 10 days when it comes to physical posting and 24 hours when it comes to email notice. But again, anything is really going to go other than 24 minutes before the meeting. It's probably a little bit late. All right, proxies. Let's talk about proxies. Proxies tend to confuse people, especially as we discuss absentee ballots and mail ballots later on. But what is a proxy? Let's talk about that first. So a proxy is not a vote. Most people think that a proxy is a vote. It's not. It is an assignment of your right to vote to another person. So the proxy itself is never a ballot. If a homeowner shows up with a proxy to a meeting, you take the proxy and you exchange it for a ballot. You cannot use a proxy to actually vote, okay? So a proxy is nothing more than permission. It's really an exchange between the pertinent homeowner and whoever they issue their proxy to. And under Colorado law, there are very, very few requirements when it comes to proxies. I could write it on a napkin and it's fine. As long as I sign it and date it, I can issue a proxy. there are really three kinds of proxies. There are proxies that can be used for quorum purposes only. In other words, the proxy says, I'm assigning my proxy to Joe to attend the meeting and to basically count towards quorum. Or I can send my proxy back to the board secretary and say, I'm assigning my proxy to the board, or I'm giving you my proxy so that you can count it towards quorum. That's one kind of proxy. Another proxy is one that says, I'm assigning my proxy to so-and-so to vote like this, and you direct them how to vote. So I want you to vote for candidate A and B in the election, and I want you to vote in favor of the assessment increase. Okay. A lot of boards think that when they have directed proxies, that they need to take the ballot, fill it out the way that the proxy indicates, and then give that to the proxy holder. Don't do that. You are not the one voting. It's the proxy holder that's voting. The question then is, how can we ensure that this proxy holder votes the way that the proxy indicates? You can't. That is an arrangement between the proxy issuer and the proxy holder. And hopefully the person who issued the proxy has a good enough relationship with this other person that they can trust them to vote the way that it's indicated. We as an association, as a board, as a community manager, don't really have privy to that proxy. We can't control how the proxy holder votes it. So if they don't vote it in accordance with what the homeowner asked them to do, that's an issue between them. That is not the association's business, okay? And I know it's kind of harsh, and a lot of people struggle with that, but it's true. It's not your job to make sure that the two homeowners, or the two individuals who are involved in this proxy transaction do what the proxy says. So that kind of a proxy that tells someone how to vote is a directed proxy. And last but not least, we have a general proxy. And that is a proxy that basically just says, I, Alina, give my proxy to Bob to attend the meeting and vote as he or she, well, I guess Bob would be a he, deems appropriate. So basically, I'm not telling them how to vote. I'm just saying, vote however you want. I trust you, vote in my stead. So those are the three basic kinds of proxies. And again, they are, the format really is going to be irrelevant. As long as you can read the proxy and I sign it and I date it, that's really all that is required, okay? Now, let's talk a little bit about just like the process, because proxies have to be allowed. Okay, first of all, you can't prohibit proxies. Even if your bylaws or your declaration say no proxies are allowed, that's not valid. That's overridden by Kiowa. Kiowa says homeowners may attend meetings in person or by proxy. If they attend by proxy, it's the same thing as them physically showing up. Even though we can't see them, they are there. So some associations, and I bet you guys know a few, manage a few, or work with a few that do this, say you must submit your proxy to the board at least, 2 days before the meeting, right? Do you know people like that, the boards that have that? Well, that's not going to fly. That violates Kiowa, which says you have to allow them to attend by proxy. So unless you're going to tell homeowners that physically attend that you have to stand outside the clubhouse 2 days early in order to be allowed into the meeting, can't do that with a proxy. It's the same thing as them showing up. So if a homeowner shows up to a meeting and they're holding a proxy, guess what? You got to let them use it, because you can't curtail when the proxy needs to be submitted. Proxies are also revocable. There's two ways that a homeowner can revoke a proxy. One is they send something in writing to the secretary that says, I revoke my proxy. Upon receipt, the proxy will be revoked. The other option is they actually physically show up to a meeting, whether it's physically or virtually, and they vote. Okay, those are the two options. So proxies may be revoked after they are issued. Sometimes you will see situations where you might be signing someone in and you get two proxies from the same property. If they are, the general rule is the one that's most recent as far as being dated, most recent is the one that's going to control. However, if they are the same date, then you can't really count either one of them because you have two different people holding a proxy from one individual. And then obviously, how do we determine who votes? You can't. So those would not count. All right. Now, the proxy forms. This, a lot of people find interesting. You do not have to provide them with your meeting notice. Did you know that? Now, most of the times we do provide them because it makes it easier, because then at least we know the proper format is being used and it helps us reach quorum. But there are situations where associations do not send proxy forms with their meeting notices. Think about your budget ratification meeting, which we'll also talk about in more detail. A lot of times associations will send notice of that meeting, but they're not attaching proxy forms. Okay, so I have been to meetings where homeowners are all up in arms. They're like, you didn't let us use proxies. What do you mean we didn't let you use proxies? You didn't give us a proxy form. Well, we don't have to give you a proxy form. You can still use proxies, you just have to create your own. So it might be a little enlightening to know that if an association sends an annual meeting notice out and does not attach a proxy, that is not a cardinal sin and it does not invalidate your meeting. You just might not get quorum at the meeting if most of your folks tend to attend via proxy. All right, the stuff in red and all caps, hopefully, is obviously something I'm saying no to. Absentee ballots, absolutely not. And we're going to talk about this again in a lot more detail when we get to the mail voting. But just know one thing, there is a difference between proxies and absentee ballots or any kind of ballots. As we said before, proxies are nothing more than a transfer of a right to vote on someone's behalf or to attend on someone's behalf. A ballot is the vote. And the way that our statutes are written, these are mutually exclusive because you either have a meeting, which could be physical, it can be virtual, but you have a meeting and you vote at the meeting. And you vote by ballots that are distributed at the meeting and the owners vote at the meeting. If you are having people vote not during the meeting, then it becomes an action outside of a meeting, which is a completely separate process with separate rules, and the two do not intermingle, okay? So don't use absentee ballots. You can use proxies, and you should use proxies at meetings, but you are not using absentee ballots. I'm sure I just confused a whole bunch of you. But we have to move on here. Secret ballots. All right, so we're talking about ballots. When do you use secret ballots? Well, you have to use them right now when we have a contested election, which means we've got what? More people running than open positions. You got to use a secret ballot. You also have to use a secret ballot if 20% of the homeowners who are present at the meeting say we want a secret ballot. I have actually not really ever seen that happen. I think I've heard of it happening once, but in all my years, I've never actually been to a meeting where that happened. But if you have 20% of the homeowners who are present in a meeting, then you have to use secret ballots. Now, since we mentioned virtual meetings here at the bottom, I think it's important to note that using secret ballots during a virtual meeting, I know we've all been through the COVID era where we've had, all our annual meetings via, Zoom, and we've had contested elections, and it is virtually impossible to do a secret ballot during a Zoom meeting. It's not impossible because I have seen associations do it. There are some platforms that will allow you to do it. I think the question is, does your board or do you as a community manager want to take the time to invest in researching this, and does your board want to pay for this, given that we're kind of past COVID? Well, I shouldn't say that, I'll probably jinx it, but that at least right now, we're not as sensitive to it as we were perhaps a year or two ago. So that is the issue. But some associations have gone that route, and it works great if you've got the right platform. Most associations do not have it. So what ends up happening a lot of times, if you're holding a virtual annual meeting and you have contested elections, is the meeting gets adjourned. You can't vote during the meeting because we don't have a mechanism for using secret ballots. And then later, you use the mail ballot system for elections. And we will talk about the mail ballot system, I promise we will. Quorum. So what's quorum? Quorum is the minimal amount of bodies you need to have. And I shouldn't say bodies because a proxy could be a body, but it's the minimum number of owners that have to be at the meeting in person or by proxy for the association to conduct business. 99% of the time, that number is in your bylaws. But be very careful when you are reviewing your bylaws to figure out what quorum is. You're going to have two separate quorum sections, one for membership meetings, and there should be another one for your board meetings. So make sure you're looking at the right section. Okay. The other thing to be careful about with quorum, and I think almost everyone overlooks this, but it could come back to bite you, is if your bylaws say, quorum is 10%, be very precise in knowing whether it's 10% of all the owners, all the votes, or of the eligible votes or owners. Big difference. So let's say you have a community with 100 units. Each one gets, one vote. And your quorum requirement is 10% of the total voting power. So that would be, with 100 units, that would be 10 units. That would be quorum. Okay. Let's say your quorum requirement is 10% of the eligible votes. And you have 10 homeowners who have lost their voting privileges because they're either delinquent in paying assessments in violation of the covenants or something like that. Then it would be 10% of 90 homeowners, because 10 are not eligible, which would mean 9 owners would be quorum. So there's a difference there, right? If it's a straight 10%, it's going to be 10. If it's 10% of those eligible, that might go down. It might go down to 9. It might be less than 9. So when you have a very close election or a very close and contested voting situation, you want to dot your I's and cross your T's when it comes to figuring out what quorum is. Because it would really, can I use the word suck? It would really suck if you used the wrong requirement and you ended up not actually meeting quorum and you thought you did. Okay, so just be careful with that. All right, at this point, I think I am going to move on. There's so many more things we can talk about with these issues, you guys. And I'm sure there's a lot of questions running through your heads as far as like, well, what about this and what about that? And we'll try to address all of that in your questions at the end. But just realize this is more of like an overview because we don't have time in 1 hour to address all the little nuances that come with these. All right, let's move on to a different kind of homeowner meeting. Let's talk about budget meetings. So again, the whole budgeting process itself, I think we have a class coming up just on the budgeting process. I think it's like in a couple months. So if you're not clear on how that all works, please make sure you sign up for that class because people continually get confused by it, and rightfully so, it is confusing. But most communities, if not, most communities fall under the Kiowa budgeting process. And the Kiowa budgeting process, as you probably know, is a ratification process, which is a little bit different than a homeowner approval process. But the budget meetings themselves have slightly different rules than our annual meeting. So as far as the timing of the notice, Kiowa says you have to use the timing set forth in your bylaws. So if your bylaws say have that 30 to 60 day mark in there as the requirements instead of the 10 to 50 as Kiowa has, you're going to have to do the 30 to 60. Okay, you're going to have to follow what your bylaws require. As far as delivering the notice, that's exactly the same as the annual meeting. You still have to snail mail or hand deliver it. You still have to physically post it. And if someone wants an email, you're still going to email it. Okay. You're going to include the budget or a summary of the budget is what Kiowa says with your notice. And most of the time you are sending it to homeowners for review and for their ratification. If your bylaws have something that say you have to get homeowner approval to increase your assessments by a certain percentage, you still have to comply with that. Quorum is another thing that's different. If you're holding your budget meeting as a separate meeting, which is what we recommend, you do not need quorum. If one person shows up, that's good enough for Kiowa. Okay, it doesn't matter who shows up or if anyone shows up. Because what's going to happen is Kiowa says, unless you have a majority of all your homeowners showing up and vetoing the budget, it's automatically ratified. In other words, it's automatically approved if you don't have a majority of all your owners vetoing it. Okay. Now, let's say you have the budget ratification portion as an agenda item on your annual meeting, and you don't schedule it separately. Okay, it's just a lot. You have something you're voting on, and one of the line items is budget ratification, elections, whatever. In that case, it becomes part of your annual meeting, and your annual meeting does require a quorum. So when you get to the budget portion, if you don't have a quorum, you're not going to be able to ratify that budget if you're doing it as part of the annual meeting. This is kind of the main reason we recommend having a separate budget ratification meeting. It doesn't mean you have to hold it on a different night. You can do them on the same night back to back, but you just want to have the notice read as two separate meetings. For example, budget ratification meeting 6:30 to 7, annual meeting 7 p.m. to 9 p.m., right? Same location or via Zoom or however you want to do it. You just want to make sure the notice is clear that you're really holding two back-to-back meetings. That way, if you don't have quorum, it doesn't matter because your budget ratification meeting doesn't require it. You may not be able to hold the annual meeting portion, but at least you can get that budget ratified, right? And start operating using your new budget. So that's kind of the rule of thumb, is try to hold them back to back, but mark them as separate meetings. Voting versus veto. So as I mentioned earlier, Kiowa says unless a majority of all, okay, so this is important, majority of all, not a majority of quorum, not a majority of those who show up, a majority of all your owners say no, it's an automatic yes. Kiowa also says that it can be a higher percentage than a majority of all. So if your declaration says a budget needs to be vetoed by 67% or by 75% of all your homeowners, then that's the requirement. It just can't be less than all, okay, than a majority of all. So if you have 100 people or 100 units in your community, this is simple math, obviously 51 would have to show up in person or by proxy to veto the budget. The process is typically pretty straightforward, even though homeowners hate it and get very upset. But typically what happens is you don't have enough people showing up at the budget meeting to veto the budget. If you need 51 people there to veto the budget, and you have 35 people who are attending, even if they all vote to veto, that's still not going to meet that threshold, right? It's still not going to be a majority of all your homeowners. which is why a lot of the times, and most of the time, I would recommend your meeting minutes for your budget meeting say, call the meeting to order at 6:30 p.m. Not enough owners present to ratify, or to veto the budget. Budget automatically ratified. Meeting adjourned at 6:02 p.m. What about the discussion? Well, that's great. You can move the discussion. You can say, the budget is ratified. We're adjourning this meeting, but we're going to continue and have the discussion at the annual meeting. Okay. So basically get in, get out, get it ratified. You're done. You can have the discussion at the annual meeting. And that, again, that's my recommendation. It's a preference. Legally, you can absolutely have that discussion during the budget ratification meeting. And I think different attorneys may have different preferences as far as when you have that discussion. But to me, if you keep it open and you have a discussion, that just leaves more time for people to run out the door and get their neighbors to attend and get a majority of everyone there because they're that upset to veto the budget. So to me, I'd rather you guys get in, get out, and then have the discussion after the fact. All right, let's move on. All right, so special meetings. Again, special meeting of a homeowners. Who gets to call those? Well, there's three options under Kiowa. There's a petition from your homeowners asking for one. The board president, all on their own, can call a special meeting, or a majority of the board can decide to call a special meeting. So those are the three options. In all honesty, when homeowners demand a special meeting, isn't it for the purpose of voting on the removal of the board for the most part? I would say 90% of the time they want to remove one or more board members. But it could be for something else. A lot of times you'll get a petition from the homeowners. I saw one that said, we demand a special meeting for the purpose of discussing something. Okay, so there's not going to be any action taken. They just want to talk about stuff. Okay. So communities cannot have a higher requirement for owner petitions than 20% of all owners. A lot of older documents will say something like 25%. I see that a lot, but that's automatically lowered to 20. So homeowners representing 20% of the total votes or the total homes in the community need to sign this petition. Now, what does the petition actually need to have? So obviously the signatures of the folks that want to hold the meeting, but it also has to set forth a purpose for the meeting. I had a call earlier from a manager today where the board, oh, not the board, the homeowners, they got their 20% and they submitted the petition, and it was, we want to hold a special meeting of the homeowners. And that's it. They said we didn't know why. Now, the manager had some ideas. There were rumors going around about why or what the purpose was, but it wasn't stated in the petition. And the Nonprofit Act says you got to have a purpose. Okay. So that, as far as I'm concerned, was not a compliant petition that would require the association to hold the meeting. But let's say it is. Let's say, you get a petition, it's signed by 20% of the homeowners, and it says, we want a special meeting to vote on the removal of all board members. Okay, what happens next? So the nonprofit kind of kicks in this case, and nonprofit says you have 30 days, you, the association, you have 30 days within which to send out notice of this meeting. Okay. So within that 30 days, you obviously want to make sure that there are 20% of the homeowners signing the petition, that the people who signed are actually homeowners and not renters, that it's not like husband and wife for one unit counting as two. So you're going to make sure you have an adequate 20%. A lot of times I get questions about, well, what if the signature is fake? How do we make sure the signature is fake? Can we knock on doors and have people verify their signature? The answer is no, you really can't and shouldn't. You have to presume that the signatures are valid and people are not committing forgery. unless you know someone's signature that well that you see, you know, like, I know this isn't Bob's signature, I'm going to go knock on Bob's door. Fine. If you know Bob that well, that you have seen his signature that many times that you know this is not him, by all means, knock on the door. But you don't just go knocking on all the doors saying, did you sign this? Okay. So you're going to assume that the signatures are valid. So once you know, or you've, confirmed that you have the 20%, within 30 days of when you receive that petition, you got to send out the meeting notice. The meeting notice, as we talked earlier, for a homeowner meeting is going to be 10 to 50 days out. So sometimes I get questions from boards. Okay, we have this request for a meeting notice, or for a special meeting to remove the board. How far out can we push it? Well, legally you could push it 80 days, right? So you have to send out the meeting notice within 30, and the meeting notice has to be 10 to 50 days out. So if you use the full 50 days and the full 30 days, that's 80 days. That's about as far as you can push it out. But what if we have our annual meeting coming up within that 80-day period? Well, it may be a moot point at that, because you're going to have an election, but maybe it won't. So you still need to set up that meeting. Okay. So you set up the meeting, you send out the meeting notice. What happens if the board or the association fails to send out the meeting notice within the 30-day period? Well, in that case, the homeowners that signed the petition, they get to call the meeting, and they call it on their own terms, right? So they're going to call it at a location they want, at a date they want, and they're going to make it, and they're going to run that meeting. So we don't want to get to the point where the board does not send something out within 30 days, because that's the only way you keep control of the situation. As far as the meeting notice, one thing to remember for special meetings is you have to put anything that's going to be voted on, any action items must be in the meeting notice and agenda. If they are not, you can't vote on them. So I use this example all the time, but I think it kind of drives the point home, and that is board receives petition from homeowners for a special meeting to remove the board. Board calls special meeting, sends out notice to all homeowners and says the purpose of this meeting is to vote on the removal of all directors. You get to the meeting, the vote is taken, the board is removed. What's next? You don't have anything in your notice that says we're going to elect a new board. And the poor manager's sitting there going, what do I do now? I don't have a board. Right? It could happen. So make sure you think these things through. If the request from the homeowners is we want to vote to remove the board, add something into your meeting notice that says if the board is removed, we are going to elect a new board. Okay? Because otherwise you're going to be left holding the bag. And you don't want, as the community manager, to be the person calling the meetings, right? You're not the board. So make sure you comply with that timing. If the association calls the meeting, the association runs the meeting. The board president is the officer who runs meetings. That can be delegated to someone else. But unless and until that board president is not on the board, they get to run the meeting. So it's still going to be an association controlled meeting. All right, finally, action by mail ballot. So the statute actually calls this action by written ballot. This is also referred to as action outside of a meeting. So that's kind of the key here, is when we talk about a mail ballot, you're using a mail ballot instead of holding a meeting. They cannot be used together because they're two separate processes and they're mutually exclusive. You're holding a meeting, great, hold your meeting, vote at the meeting. You're not voting at the meeting, great, adjourn the meeting or don't hold the meeting and then do your mail ballot process. So for this reason, you have to be very clear. When you're using your mail ballot, you are not holding a meeting to vote on this issue. You are also never going to use proxies when you use a mail ballot. Why don't we use proxies? Remember, a proxy is allowing another person to attend a meeting for you and vote. A proxy cannot be used to just give someone your right to vote when there's no meeting. So there's no proxies that are going to be used. If I, as a homeowner, want to participate in this decision, I'm going to get a mail ballot and I'm going to fill it out and I'm going to send it back. It's as simple as that. So don't get confused with proxies when it comes to any kind of a mail ballot vote. So you have probably seen and conducted mail ballot votes with things like if you're ever amending any of your governing documents, right? You're amending the declaration, you're amending the bylaws, you're voting on a special assessment, you're voting on an assessment increase that's above a cap in your declaration. So there's a lot of different things that you might be voting on that is easier to use a mail ballot for than to actually hold a meeting. But if you're using a mail ballot, I highly, highly, highly encourage you to use the association's legal counsel to prepare those documents for you. The reason is that the Nonprofit Act has some very, very specific requirements of how these documents need to be drafted and the information they need to contain. If you are missing even one of those items, you are not going to have a valid vote, and even if you got enough homeowners to say yes, it's still not going to pass because it was an invalid vote. Okay, so just a few things to be aware of. When you're using a mail ballot, it's going to come with a solicitation letter. Okay, the solicitation letter has to contain a date by when the ballots have to be received. Received, not sent. Okay, that's important. When they have to be received to be counted. You cannot have something in your letter that says we must receive ballots within 30 days of the date of this letter. You have to put the actual date in there. Okay. You have to spell out what is required for this measure to pass. So if it's a declaration amendment, for example, you need to spell out that in order for this amendment to be adopted, it must receive approval from owners representing at least 67% of the total voting power in the association, or whatever it is you have. Okay. You have to tell them what quorum is too. Sometimes it's completely irrelevant. So like I was just saying, let's say the sole purpose of the mail ballot is to vote on a declaration amendment. We're going to change one provision. Okay, I've done this before with a community. And of course, that requirement is like 67% of everyone has to approve it. So who cares what quorum is, right? It doesn't matter if quorum is present. We need far more than quorum. We need 67% of everybody. So we had a community and we put the actual mail ballot documents together for this community, and the board looked at it and said, well, this is silly. We're going to take out the whole quorum sentence because we don't care what quorum is. They didn't ask us. They just took it out and sent everything out that way. So guess what happened? They got the votes, but they didn't get the amendment because they did not comply with the statutory requirement. Statutes don't always make sense, but we got to follow them to a T if we want to have a valid and proper mail ballot vote. The other thing that's required is that you have to provide the owners with enough information on whatever the ballot measure is for them to make an educated decision. Okay, they need to know. So if you're voting on a special assessment, you at least need to tell them what that money's going towards. I would recommend you have more than that in there. I mean, if you've already know, who the contractors might be, if you already know how the payments split up, like what goes for which repair, what specifically are we doing? I mean, the more information you can add, the better, because the statute isn't clear as to what enough information is. If you're doing an election by mail ballot, guess what? I would add summaries, bios for each of the candidates if you can, because that provides owners with information. And then the ballots themselves, a couple of things. One is, with the exception of elections, you have to provide on the ballot an opportunity for owners to vote for or against the proposed action. So you can't just say, you know, if you fail to return this, we'll consider this a yes vote, or we'll consider this a no vote. You have to say, give them the option to check a box, yes, I approve this, or no, I do not approve this. They have to have both options. With an election, you don't need to do that, thank goodness. That would be messy. But everything else you do. And the other thing with the ballots, the written ballots, is they cannot be revoked. Once they are sent and received, the homeowner can't call you and say, you know what, I changed my mind. I don't like how I voted. I want to change my vote. Nope, sorry, too late. Can't do it. Okay, cannot revoke a written ballot. So that's also another important thing to remember. The other important thing is the deadline to receive ballots can't be more than 60 days from the day, well, it's really 60 days from when you receive your first response. Okay, but we can't predict when that's going to be. So I typically will say do 60 days from the day you send the letter. If you want to be really kind of, you know, not really, but somewhat risky, do 62 days from when you send the letter, because you have to, you figure what, you know, we're gonna allow for a couple days for the mail to reach the person and for them to respond. But ultimately, you know, 60 days is the max. That's another statutory provision. So we can't allow more than 60 days, and we cannot extend the deadline. So if you do not use the full 60 days and you say, we're going to send out the ballots on June 1st and the deadline is going to be June 30th, once you send it out and you have June 30th as the deadline, you can't extend it, even though you haven't used the full 60 days. You have to go to that deadline. If you don't have enough votes, too bad. You're going to have to start it all over again from scratch. So do try to use the 60 days if you can, because ultimately that's our best bet, especially if you have a very high approval requirement. So ultimately, common mistakes. We've kind of covered these already in the specifics, but just things that we see. So not using snail mail to deliver notice, not physically posting notice, sending out notice, and it's too late or it's too early. Just remember 10 to 50 days. Proxies, either not allowing proxies altogether or having submission deadlines. You must submit your proxy 2 days in advance, right? No. Calculating quorum, having their own quorum. Eligible to vote versus total. And then, of course, associations preparing their own mail ballots. Again, very rarely, there have been a couple occasions, I do admit, there have been a couple occasions where I have had boards, they prepared their own ballots and their own cover letters, and they did it right. I'm not saying it can't be done, but what I'm saying is, why take the chance that it's not done? At least have your attorneys review it if you don't want to pay them to actually draft the documents. Okay, there's a lot of other issues that I'm sure you have all seen come up, but these are some pretty big ones that we see in the industry. So just be careful with all of this. And again, if you have any questions or on the side of caution, call the association's legal counsel to answer your questions about meeting minutes. It is it's truly the best way to keep your communities safe. So I am going to, okay, it looks like we have quite a few questions, so I'm going to try and go through all of these. We got 10 minutes, 11 minutes. I see a question about handouts. Hopefully everybody received them. We emailed them out. They should have been emailed out this morning, I believe. So if you don't have them, please shoot us an email at the address I gave you earlier, education@altitude.law. We'll definitely send you a copy, but you should have it, hopefully. All right, physical posting for notices for second homeowner For second homeowner communities with Zoom meetings, yeah, you're still going to have to physically post it, and whether it's a sandwich board or a flyer that goes on the bulletin board that says we're having an annual meeting, it's going to be via Zoom on this date at this time, contact so-and-so for the link. That's all you need to do, or put the link on there. You still need to post. There's no exceptions for virtual meetings. Okay. Should proxies be used for budget ratification meetings? And that is a great question. So I have a lot of associations that do not send proxy forms with their notice of budget ratification meetings because they don't want to have, enough people there to veto the budget. It's not against the law not to send them. It's a strategic thing, but just keep in mind, whether or not you send the forms, you still have to accept the proxies. So if a homeowner shows up and they have proxies, you're going to have to accept those proxies, right? And allow them to have a veto vote against the budget if that's what they want to do with that proxy. If the association doesn't have a place to physically post notice, where does it have to be put? Can it be posted on a website where all other HOA information is posted? Well, it should be posted on the website, and I just kind of assume that if you have a website, you're posting stuff there about meetings. So Kiowa says, in a conspicuous location, if feasible. So there is kind of that exit language, if feasible. But honestly, you have a community that doesn't have like an entrance monument, you can't post it at the entry point, or you can't post it by mailboxes. I would find it very difficult to believe there's nowhere to post. But if you truly have a community where everyone has their own mailbox, it's an old community, there's no monument, there's no common area anywhere, there's no playground, there's nothing, then yeah, I guess you can't really physically post it. But it should be an exception, not a rule. Does this apply to Zoom meetings as well? And I assume, I'm not sure if this is a question with respect to physical posting, but if it is for physical posting, then yes, you do still have to physically post. All right. I'm wondering if posting a meeting notice online within the association's calendar qualifies as a physical post. It does not. A physical post is an actual piece of paper that is printed out, okay, and placed somewhere. Posting it electronically is great. It's recommended and in some cases required, but that does not suffice for the physical posting. So it's different. When you say eligible, does that mean that the owner must be current in their assessments? Usually that's what it means. Usually an eligible voter, in the association is someone who is not in violation of the covenants, whether it's being delinquent or being in violation otherwise. You obviously need to look at your documents for your community because some documents do not specifically speak to taking away someone's right to vote if they're not in good status, in which case you cannot take away their right to vote. And in that kind of a community, everyone's going to be eligible to vote. But some, and quite a few communities have language that say, if you're delinquent, and there might be some specifics in there, like what's considered delinquent, if you're delinquent by more than 30 days. If you aren't in compliance with the covenant and you've been given notice and you've had your opportunity for a hearing, then you can lose your eligibility to vote. So you got to look at the documents to see specifically what that might mean for your community. It might mean different things for different associations. If the association receives an ineligible nominee for an open board of directors position, do you disclose that they are not eligible per the governing documents, or do you disclose why they are not eligible? So when you say they're not eligible to run for the board, I'm assuming you have something in your bylaws in the director qualifications that says, in order to serve on the board, you must be an owner in good standing. If you don't have that language, then anyone is going to be eligible to run for the board if they fall under, being a homeowner or being on the deed, whatever else might be required. So when you say someone's ineligible, be careful with that and make sure your bylaws speak to what that means as far as someone being ineligible. But if they are ineligible and they want to run for the board, I would simply tell them you can't, you're not eligible. I mean, if that's the case. If it's a nomination from the floor, then I think a statement may be made that I'm sorry, this person is not eligible to run, and leave it at that. I would not go into details as to why they are not eligible. I would just say, I'm sorry, they're not eligible. For a budget veto, are proxies included in the number to meet the majority of all owners? Yes, they are. Remember, proxies are the same as somebody showing up. Okay. What if all board members are voted out at a special meeting and it's stated that new board will be elected, but no one wants to serve on the board? Wouldn't that be ironic? Well, then again, you're kind of back to square one, which is we don't have a board, and you, community manager, are kind of stuck holding the bag, in which case I think it really depends on, you know, the management company stance. A lot of management companies would probably say, well, we're not going to represent this community. Sorry, I was about to sneeze and it went away. I hate that. So, you know, again, if there's no board, then essentially there's no one to make decisions on behalf of the association. We don't recommend management companies act as the board. I mean, other than if you want to try calling a meeting to get someone elected, we've worked with management companies to do that. But if you can't get anyone to run for the board, I think you need to see kind of what the management company's position is with respect to those types of situations. Can the HOA use an electronic/internet ballot to vote rather than a paper ballot? So that's a great question. And the answer is, if you are voting during a meeting, okay, you have a meeting and you're voting during the meeting and there is a way to vote electronically, okay, like I can go on my phone and I can type in a code and I can vote that way, then yes, you can do it that way. If you're voting secretly at a meeting, again, and there's a way to electronically vote and have it be secret, yes, you can do it that way. If you are voting outside of a meeting, the statute has not yet caught up to technology standards these days, and it still requires the association to actually send out all the stuff we talked about and the homeowners to complete the ballot. So homeowner can scan their completed ballot and email it to the association unless it's a secret ballot. But short of that, there really is not a quote unquote kosher way to electronically vote outside of a meeting. With a mail ballot and board member election, is there any protocol for announcing the winners? I think it's like use your best judgment, honestly. Most of the time, you know, when you do a mail ballot, they get counted, and within a day or 2 days, I would send something out if you have email addresses, or I would post something on the website. There's nothing that says you have to like send a mail, you know, snail mail to everyone, but I would at least post something on the website and do it that way. If the association's bylaws say that the budget ratification should be held at the annual meeting, can you still hold a separate meeting at a different time for a budget ratification? That is amazing. I've never seen a set of documents do that. If you have a set of documents that say that, I would argue, and again, you might have different opinions from different attorneys, but the statute says you have to hold a budget ratification meeting. And I would argue that we have to hold a budget ratification meeting. And if it's not on the same night, especially as the annual meeting, we can hold them separately. However, I think the safest answer is please amend that requirement out of your documents. It may require homeowner approval. But I would recommend amending it out or complying with it just to be safe. What time is it? Okay, one more question. I think we're not going to get to all of these, but in reference to this. Does this apply to Zoom? Can you accept proxies at the meeting? Oh, so in reference to the proxy issue, does this apply to Zoom meetings? Can you accept proxies at the meeting, or do they have to be received before the meeting starts? I would say, you know, we can put something in the virtual meeting policy that says they must be received by the time the meeting is called to order, but we can't have them require that they be received a day ahead of time. You know, I would say, you know, if the meeting starts at 5, they must be received by 5 or something like that. But other than that, you know, you're risking the challenge that it's not valid. Can you always post notice if your signs are on the common elements, such as a road or boulevard? I'm not sure what I mean. Yes, if you're talking about notice of meetings, if it's not our property, it might be an issue to post notice there. Like if it's private, if it's a public right of way, we might not be able to. I think you would want to get in touch with the municipality and ask. And is there a hybrid way to vote by proxy and an electronic platform? Again, proxies are used when there is a meeting. So you can have proxies and allow attendees at the meeting to vote electronically, like we said before. But if you're voting outside of a meeting, then no, you can't do either of those. That's the end, actually. Yay, we got through it. Thanks so much for joining me, you guys. We'll see you next time. And I hope you have an amazing rest of your day. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.